Okay, welcome you to another interesting class in our global history of slavery. So far, I think we have examined various issues, various polemical and very controversial issues about the transatlantic slave trade. We've looked at the dynamics of the slave trade, the origin of the slave trade, the institution itself, and how it was a global phenomenon, in the past. All right, encompassing uh, interesting states, beyond even what is known as uh, West Africa. Right, in East Africa, slavery was a profound institution that probably shaped the lives of the people before colonialism. All right, so in this context, we are now going to be examining the role and involvement of Africans. Last week it seems that we were quite Afrocentric in our discussion, concentrating much on the roles of the Europeans in the pernicious and horrifying enterprise. So today, what we're going to do is to focus on the intricacies within Africa itself, especially the mobilization of warriors by the African elite, the ruling elite, the chiefs, the kings, all right, the warlords, and how they empower other insurgents within and outside their domain to generate anarchy through which people were abducted and sold as slaves. So, what we're going to see today is that Africa had also been much involved in this slave trade when it started in the 15th century, although it might be said that the magnitude and the dynamics differed from one region to another, whether from West Africa to East Africa, or from Dahomey to uh, Porto Novo or to Lagos to Oyo and all of that. But generally, events within African interior, some of them unrelated to the transatlantic slave trade, provided opportunities, provided a springboard for African elites to participate in the uh, nefarious trade. So it is not completely correct in a way to say that Africans were not involved in the slave trade from its inception, because there has been a series of arguments that have been put forward that, oh no, it was Europeans that were capturing people. Without the aid, without the instrumentality of the African elite, the kings, the warriors, the chiefs, slavery would have died a natural death, as I've told someone last week, because it is clear that before the 19th century, the European the Europeans' activities in Africa, in West Africa particularly, was basically around the coastal environment, coastal communities. So most of the Europeans didn't penetrate into the interior, the hinterland of West Africa. All right, it was in the 19th, so between 15th century and the 18th century, all right, especially 17th and 18th century, which marked the epoch, the zenith of the transatlantic slave trade. How were slaves captured? So Europeans were not going into the interior to a large degree and intensity. So it was their collaboration with the indigenous elites that fostered, that engendered the supply, the steady supply of slaves, basically. So the introduction of European guns and gunpowder was one of the critical factors in the escalation of the uh, of anarchy into the interior of West Africa, and this uh, gun and gunpowders, was a critical factor that aided the abductors, those who were abducting people. So the people nearer to the coast, for instance, found it easier to get these weapons to wage wars on the hinterland, because they were the ones who had contact first contact with the Europeans because of the proximity of the Atlantic, shores to the Europeans. All right. So self-induced warfare rather than protracted territorial or political clashes was a major factor used by African agents in the acquisition of slaves. All right. So are you following me basically? So
Yes, sir.
so it was this through the interior. It was the collaborations between the Europeans in the interior, all right, collecting guns, collecting mirror, collecting textile, collecting clothes, all right, shoes, and perhaps money that actually led to the fragmentation of the African society. People use the gun obtained from the Europeans to prosecute wars, on their brethren, kingsmen in the neighboring communities. All right, so it was a period of anarchy. All right, no, it was a time where the indigenous social structure that we examined 2 weeks ago collapsed. All right, if you read Chinua Achebe's Things Fall Apart, again, all right, it quite resonates with the happenings in the pre-colonial period. Chinua Achebe's famous line says that turning and turning within the widening gear, the falcon can no longer hear the falconer. Anarchy is loose upon all men when the center does not hold and things fall apart, if I got it correctly. So it will show you how the little form of inducement enabled African elite and warriors, the privileged class, to induce warfare, all right, and made it a critical instrument in capturing people. So by the 17th century, African merchants had dominated the trade in slaves from the interior. All right, so they had all the imagine collecting guns and ammunition from Europeans for over 100 and 200 years. So by the 17th century, they had become highly entrenched in the business of slavery. All right, so the new orientation to the slave trade brought about fragmentation, it brought about isolation, it brought about entanglement of people. And the people were structurally dislocated via the reduction in the male population as the warlords and abductors were invading communities. They were not targeting the feeble, as I've told you. They were targeting the physical, artisanal, and the intellectual strength of each society, the men, the able-bodied men and women. So the social changes occasioned by this expansion of the transatlantic slave trade paved the way for the creation of an indigenous slave merchant class and the further enrichment of a class of slave owners. And this is quite so in tracing the history of misrule, of apathy, of opprobrium, of perfidy, of duplicity, opacity, of opaqueness, of corruption, of bribery, of betrayal, of mistrust, of distrust, all right, lack of national collective ideology, all right, no zero statesmanship, no recklessness, no aversion, and various vices of this. This was the period that all of this crept into African social, social psyche. All right, when people started behaving, functioning negatively by default. All right, you want to understand how today's elite, right, become so heartless, that they have lost consciousness of what matters. Recently, I was reading a report in in there. I was in a workshop discuss this the conversation where the an account of a prominent Nigerian elite was brought to bear about acquiring. He came to the UK, all right, and acquiring properties. He went to this place. He had even lost count of memory of the properties he had in the UK. Just buying and buying. He went to a place and told his real estate manager that I would like to have this property. And the real estate manager told him, oh, you can't be saying that this property already belonged to you. You bought it 10 years ago. So it tells you the avarice, the perversion of the primitive accumulation of the typical African elite, and this is traceable, all right, in this context to uh, the uh, the transatlantic slave trade, especially with the exchanges that occurred between the Europeans and the African elite. All right, how the idea of indigenous merchant class, elite class, all right, whose only interest is the enrichment of is to worship the gods of their own belly, to the detriment of their collective existence, communal existence. So slave owners from the 17th centuries found that their prosperity depended on a strong state support for the institution of slavery, and that, of course, for the slavery institution to thrive, and they began to organize themselves into a conscious class. So when you look at the ways in which the political elite, either in PDP or APC, all right, in Nigeria are functioning, you need to understand, back it can be traced back to history. All right, the unholy alliance. So that is why I always tell people that the problem of the Nigerian state is not ethnic or racial, ethnic or religious, inspired. It is a class. All right. That is why Karl Marx would say that the history the history of all hitherto existing society is the history of class struggle. And that is further corroborated by Michel Foucault, all right, who said history is not a predictable mechanism, but the most problematic site, right, often accentuated by random conflict between classes of people. All right, so the elite class converge. They have no issue about religion, they have no issue about ethnicity or tribes or language. All right. So in the pre-colonial society, it wasn't that Lagos, perhaps the Oba of Lagos or the king of Dahomey, all right, or that of Kutonu, Port Novo, or the Mandinka king, all right, or that in Ashanti. It wasn't that the king invaded another kingdom. So yeah, in the 19th century, that actually transpired, as I'm going to demonstrate. But there was an unholy alliance, a complex web of diplomatic negotiations agreement between these pre-colonial states. So each agreeing to cross, transfer or to transfer war captives. All right, if, for instance, Oyo Wade raided communities around its neighborhood. So Oyo had a very, very strong diplomatic or no unwritten agreement, for instance, with Bogu, or for instance, with Dahomey, to supply the slaves raided from within its environs. So complex state alliances, slave owners, African elite found their prosperity dependent on a strong state support for the institution of slavery to thrive. And African indigenous middlemen, were very influential as traders, all right, as facilitator. This merchant class would consist of African rulers themselves, the kings in different domains, the chiefs, the warriors, and individual members of notable family. So some of the prominent families, all right, were key drivers of this obnoxious, this horrifying, and undignified enterprise that lasted for several centuries. In Yoruba land, it was quite very, very uh, common for elites, all right, to have negotiations and arrangement through which slaves were supplied. And there were also several associations of slave traders. For instance, the Papa Society, in the Jebu Ode, all right, and the Parakoyi of Abeokuta, all right, as well as other trade associations in Yoruba, especially during the 18th and the 19th century. So you could imagine, just as you have in markets, in Yaba market, for instance, association of bureau de change merchants, or association of uh, imports, all right, clothes importers in Yaba and all of that, or even in Oyibo, association of pepper seller in the market. That was the extent of degeneration of African social system in the 18th and 19th century, where several associations of slave traders, emerge, such as the Pampa Society in the Jebu and the Parakoyi of Abeokuta, right? And it was quite alarming. So the king and chiefs, especially in towns near the coast, were able to profit from this situation. So these kings sanctioned they approved of this association, that these kind of associations existed in their various domain. All right. So they gave credence to it. All right. It was not done without their imprimatur. That would tell you about the level of involvement and complicity of the indigenous elites. And this was possible through the gates mounted at the entrances of the different towns, all right, where tolls and duties were even collected. So in most cases, as people were mobilizing slaves from one town or country, one state through another, so the individuals, the different states even exerted, collected tolls, all right, tools, all right, for people to move slaves across. The Parakoyi, along with the Odoni, for instance, shared the proceeds from the gates, all right, while in Ijebu, for instance, most of the proceeds accrue to the Awujale, the Oba of Ije. So slave raiders depended strongly or enormously on militarism and warfare in acquiring slaves for slaves. So as I've told you at the beginning, the Europeans were not coming, Europeans were not traveling into the interior themselves to obtain these slaves. So the Europeans they relied strongly on the instrumentality of the people themselves, the elite themselves, who were doing the kidnapping, the abduction, all right, and transferring these as slaves. There were middlemen, all right, which I'm still going to talk about, all right. There were middlemen in different domains who carried out some of these nefarious activities. Give me a minute. So there were middlemen in each of these domains who were involved in this, who were complicit, especially with regards to the trading of their various people to the Europeans. There's kidnapping. I'm going to show you quite a lot of biographical or ethnographic account of how most of these were actually done during the 19th century. So the key issue that I was trying to mention is that this depended on militarism and warfare. All right, in Yoruba land, for instance, the Jebu military men were able to uh, collect able-bodied men. All right, comprising slaves and freeborn. All right, and most of these people were done through the endorsements. All right, even the payment of a shakole to the Awujale, all right, the kings. So they were also different war lords and also war slave merchants, all right, who were divided into companies of 50, hundreds, or even 200 men, each headed by an Olorogun, for instance, among the Jebu people. So this tells you the complex nature of organization of this state. So although volunteer army during the warfare enlistment was quite mandatory for all able men in some part of Yoruba land, right? But rich men could pay, who could not pay, all right, to enlist in this army, could also send a substitute soldier. So it was a critical factor of militarism, or the building up of strong army by individual pre-colonial states, especially among the Yoruba, was a major source of slave acquisition. So it was, patriotic for an average citizen to enlist in the army, and the promises of reward after the sales of captives made the military a noble profession. So people were enlisting in pre-colonial military formations from the 19th century, not basically because of any logical or rational motivation, but because of the loyalty forced to the state. All right. The number two is that they will also be able to accrue, all right, maybe some divid, some if Ijebu, for instance, raided the Kale people and obtained 200 slaves. So not all the 200 slaves will go to the warlords and the kings. So the soldiers themselves, the mercenaries themselves, will probably be able to retain maybe 10 slaves each. So this tells you, so in this case, many Ijebu people, like those in Owu, Ife, Ibadan, Ijayi, enlisted in the army for the monetary benefit they could get from the sales of war captives. And this is quite, this is central to the research I'm doing in Oxford now, how to see how the indigenous social kinship system collapsed during the 19th century. This system of solidarity and cohesion that had existed for centuries, all right, just collapsed as people, joined the state military formation who were abducting, who were insurgents in nature. Individuals enlisted in the army to raid other people in other communities so that they could also benefit some pecuniary gains through the sales of war captives, especially those as slaves. So to avoid counter raids, most times, a special force of about 1,000 men was also set up to police the palace and local community. So as it is usually said, in Yoruba land, and I'll paraphrase, he who delights in beheading uh, people would not allow another man to walk behind them with a cutlass. So each of these colonial states garrison protected their palaces, their town, all right, to avoid a replication of what they do to other people. All right, so most of them protect their palace of their Oba with as much as 1,000 men. All right, to police their local community. Senior Ijebu soldiers, for instance, in the 19th century, who performed these tasks were Kalejaye, for instance, if you have for those who are from Ijebu, the Arowo Sanle, the Osunlalu, Ogunade, all right, in 19th century. You have the Jaye Simi of Ikorodu and the popular Kuku of Ijebu, all right. And these were some of the people who performed some of these tedious tasks. The 19th century warfare produced many slaves, not among the Yoruba, not only among the Yoruba, all right, but among the pre-colonial, vast, pre-colonial societies in West Africa, all right, whose interest was the acquisition of slaves. So many of these slaves, the rulers and chiefs, conducted warfare with a view to obtain war captives. So between 1817 and 1822, all right, the forces in Yoruba land, the Jebu forces, for instance, were aligned with Ife and Oyo and a section of the Egba to attack other towns like the Owu, all right, and Ijesha, taking away many slaves whom they shared equally and sold directly to the African middlemen, basically. So the army also, in most cases, split into camps, both led by the veteran Ife soldiers, all right, especially in the 19th century, Ife soldiers, the Maye, Okwande, and the Labosinde, all right. So each of these, unanimously decide to conduct expeditions against other people, right? Of course, in most cases, it was a form of counterattack, right? But the critical, the modus operandi of all of this was to basically acquire slaves, war captives. So another means through which pre-colonial societies and rulers, including and particularly among the Yoruba rulers and warriors, got slaves in the 18th and 19th century was raiding. So individual masqueraded. So this goes beyond the role of the state now. All right, now I've talked about the role of the state. So there were also instances where individuals raided, also committed themselves to raiding people within their local community and beyond, and kidnap people. So they capitalize the on the breakdown of law and order, all right, to prey on foreign traders. So traders, people who are traveling, to commercial activities from maybe from Oyo to Bogu or from Lagos, all right, to the Bariba, to trade with the Bariba. So individuals, just like we have today now with kidnapping, all right. So most of the kidnapping are not exclusively the reserve of the Fulani. So there are individuals within different ethnic formations who have now acquired the monopoly of violence. so kidnapping people. So this was also the same situation. They capitalized on the breakdown of law and order to prey on foreign traders and careless indigents, especially those who went alone to the farm. And if you have read the story, the biography of Ekwano Oluda, all right, you'll be able to see how himself and his sister were captured when their parent had gone to war. All right, the abductors, sneak into their community, raided, raised the community down by fire and captured this young boy, right, who was about age 12 or so, and the younger sister lesser than that. And both of them were, carried to the coast, and each of them were sold differently to different parts. One probably was sold to America, the other one was sold to Europe. And here he recorded the kind of defilement which he saw, how the abductors, all right, in various processes, the ways in which they molested the sister and all of this. It was a quite terrifying scenario to imagine. So individuals played a critical role in the institutionalization of the slave. To illustrate, for instance, in the 1820s, bands of kidnappers infested the Jebu roads and frequently seized farmers and traders. Slaves were also presented as gifts among the Yorubas. All right, in most cases, influential people, use slaves as a form of the way some of you buy on the Valentine Day now, or maybe Salah is coming. Some people will want to buy their girlfriend or their boyfriend some gifts. So slaves were also used as a form of appreciation, basically, in among the notable. So slaves were also presented, right, as gifts, as I've mentioned. For instance, in the resolution of the dispute among the Ijebu chiefs over the appropriate response to the late 19th century Yoruba wars. All right, Seriki Ogunshigun of Ijebu, for instance, was fined 11 slaves and 300 bags of cowrie, from which the Awujale and his chiefs in council got 5 slaves each. So different Yoruba kings, chiefs, and merchants also bought slaves from neighboring markets, especially from their allies. This is to tell you how lucrative this scenario was, particularly during the period under discussion. Are we still together, please?
Yes, sir.
Yes, sir.
Yes, sir.
Great.
Yes, sir.
So one of the principal effects of the Yoruba of African civil war, religious social war in the 18th and 19th century was that there was no shortage in the supply of slaves. So the critical factor or motivating factor behind the religious, whether you talk about the Fulani jihads in West Africa, all right, you talk about the collapse of Yoruba state system, all right, the Oyo and the ensuing or concomitant, if you like, what's known as Yoruba wars of the 19th century. The critical denominator was the quest to obtain slaves. It was not because that Owu defined Ile-Ife as it was said that Owu committed sacrilege against Ife or Ijebu did this to Ibadan. No, that was not the case. The critical motivating factor is to obtain slaves, all right, among the elite. So when you begin to see how the political elite in contemporary African society doesn't care about the electorate, about the masses, it is not it is not a recent development. All right, it has its antecedent, its roots in the 18th, 17th, 16th century. All right, probably it was non-existent. Such vices was rare before the 15th century, but from the 16th century thereabout, African elite became so reckless. All right, this became so evil to the extent of betraying indeed common trust and common bond among themselves. So one of such popular parts in Yoruba where Africans were probably which where people gave instances of civil war as the justification was the Akpomu, all right, a situation where people raided each other on the account of, but more than that, people conducted warfare with a view to obtaining uh, slaves. So I've mentioned earlier that with the involvement of Africans, the number of slaves ports also increase in different parts of West Africa. When I want to talk about endowment, all right, in Senegal, in Sierra Leone, in Gold Coast, all right, across all the ports, cities, in pre-colonial area, in Lagos, all right, in Badagry, the various ports emerged. So it was not only in Lagos that slaves were being so for in what area that became known as Nigeria, the bulk of the slaves obtained in different parts were either shipped from Lagos, all right, or through Porto Novo, Badagry, all right. Some of them are through Calabar, and quite just to give you an instance, in Sierra Leone, in Senegambia, you have quite a number of ports, all right, through which slaves Dahomey also had its own thriving ports. So one of such popular ports in Yoruba land, for instance, was Akpomu. All right, we have Ketu and Badagry, where slave buyers, for instance, from several powerful African states converge to buy and sell their captives. So it was just a place, it was a general, just as you go to general market to buy commodities in Oyindo or Idumota market. That was how slave market was, to show you the level of degeneration. All right, so apart the degradation of African humanity in the 19th century. Trade in the Bight of Biafra was heavily concentrated, for instance, in major ports situated in Elem, the Calabari area, or what is now known as New Calabar, and Boni, both in the present-day Niger Delta and at Old Calabar on the Cross River. So the offshore and the coastal river systems also helped to determine the location of trading venues in different parts of West Africa, in Sierra Leone, for instance, or in Gambia, ensuring that the the slaves captured from different areas were easily exported, all right, to the Europeans. So most of the water routes or channels were probably maximized by this reckless African elite who would. So I'll speak to this slide shortly. So all of these ports were used a way to maximize the shipment of all of these slaves from their various domains. So at the port, slaves were displayed mostly for sale in many ways. They could be sold in confined spaces, all right, such as courtyard, all right, to prevent escapes. Most of them will be locked in a barricaded cage, all right, like dogs. All right, in those days, maybe dogs are not kept inside cage again now, but in those days, dogs used to be kept inside. So that's the way people were kept inside, cages to prevent escape and to provide the privacy required to watch after them, for instance, before they are sold. So in this situation, buyers went into the secured places where the slaves were kept to negotiate for them and to buy them. So slaves were also chained in rows and displayed for sales in open markets. All right, and they were usually chained from 50 to 100 in ways impossible for anyone to escape. I believe some of you have watched the documentary The Roots, all right, the story of Kinta Kunte. And if you have not watched it, I think you must do so before the exam. It will widen your horizon and gives you a very broad understanding of the development that we're talking about. All right, so the story was also the same in the Calabar, where Robin John Duke and Pope NSC's family dominated some of this slave trade. They own most of these slave stores. All right, but dominantly, of course, because these stores are usually kept around the coastal areas, in a way to keep the ship, all right, awaiting the ships that will export them. So Liverpool traders, all right, played a critical role of course, various European countries played a critical role in the sales or in the trade of these various commodity in Africa during this period of study. But in the 19th century, all right, there were also individuals, European merchants, all right, and African elites and merchants who acted as key political figure, all right, and agents working with the Europeans on behalf of their kings, all right, to sell slaves and bring return. So the bulk of the slaves obtained in the 19th century were secured through a series of coordinated attacks. I've mentioned that earlier. For instance, the Bariba, for instance, the people inland from Oyo had exacted tribute and collected slaves from the Takpa. All right, that is the Nupe people to which Oyo itself was a tributary. So these slaves were mostly sold right to African merchants from other nations such as the Alada, that is people from Porto Novo, the Kumasi area, which is the capital of Ashanti, and Ketu in Dahomey. Ketu is in Dahomey. It is not the Ketu in Nigeria. So these were some of the channel. And by the beginning of the 18th century, the Bariba captives were taken by Oyo armies and sold into slavery through the coast of Bogu. You could see the dynamics. So the proceeds were sent to the king and the chiefs of Oyo through their representatives who were in charge of collection of monies made from the pernicious, obnoxious, nefarious, horrifying enterprise. In 1818, between 1818 and 1820, for instance, also following the Fulani Jihad and the interruption of peace in various parts of West Africa, all right, including Yoruba land, which had led to the establishment of northern Oyo town of Ilorin as an empire of in allegiance to Sokoto Caliphate. The Dahomey and the Ashanti, for instance, identified new sources of trade to the southwest of Hausa land across Bogu. All right, so these were new formation, new slave formation, new slave ports or channels were created. That's what I'm trying to say. So the rulers of these states therefore commissioned their soldiers to wage attacks on the Sokoto Caliphate with the aim of returning with a minimum of 100 slaves. So the Fulani Jihad of the 19th century was a highly hypocritical, highly nefarious jihad. It had nothing to do with purification, with holiness, as Usman Fodio and its likes proclaim. All right. So the jihad and like order of the religious reformation crusade were carried out basically to acquire slaves, and that was the same in different parts of West Africa, not just Nigeria. All right. In the same year, all right, where in the 19th century also, there were quite a number of total raids by one communities and the over the other. So each of them sent troops, all right, to targeting weak, vulnerable people, all right, in a view to capture hundreds of slaves, all right, and the Ashanti's veteran, were also financed by their rulers to procure as many slaves around the lower Niger, from the Busai, the Raba area, all right, southward of the Delta through the Lagoon of Lagos. So it tells you the complexity, or the intractability of some of these issues. And there were also quite a number of complex structure through which people some scholars like Robin Law, for instance, and Paul Lovejoy, in their popular study, they have been able to interview a group of six. Their study interviewed a group of six Hausa slaves in Brazil and narrated. Each of them narrated as follows. One says that two among them were brought to the coast via the Bogu. All right, and I'm quoting directly now. One called Matthew, a native of Daura, enslaved in war with Fulani, presumably in the course of the Sokoto Jihad, recalled traveling through Kano and Zaria to the Hausa city of Benin. All right, and second slave called Benedito was from Gaia in the northwest Hausa land and enslaved by robbers from Nupe. As you could see, so I went further to say that this guy was embarked on the river Niger at an unidentified place called Aku. and traveled from there via. Can that person mute his or herself? Can that person mute his or herself? Okay, so I was saying that the second slave called Benedito from Gaia in northwest Hausa land was enslaved by robbers from Nupe. So he was embarked on the River Niger at an unidentified place called Aku and traveled from there via Bogu and Oyo to be exported from Porto Novo, that is Ajashe. All right, so the other four of his friends were taken to the coast by the more easterly route via Nupe and the Yoruba land. You could see the complex. So there, just as we have boundary tree in the northwest, northeast, everything which has become an epidemic. That was the same way, all right. No, it was in the 19th and 19th century where people were just captured and raided from different parts and they were whisked, all right, through other channel to be exported. In Bahia, Francis de Costello also interviewed slaves who had traveled from the interior of the Bight of Benin through Bogu to the coast. So one of such was Mohammed Manuel, who had been born in Kano, but was captured during a military expedition which happened into Bogu around 1842 or 1843, being conducted from Bogu to Ilorin after his capture. So ultimately reaching, he got to the coast via Ogbomosho. Right? Imagine someone captured from Bogu area, was transported through Ogbomosho before being taken via Abeokuta and Ijebu to Lagos. This was a time, for instance, where there was no efficient transport system. You could see, apart from the torture of enslavement itself, you could see the tedious process through which slaves were transported. So most of these, in most cases, apart from those who were carried on horses, some were made to trek, chained, and forced to walk long distances before they could get to the slave port. So another slave named Aro Manuel from Bonu had also been imprisoned in war and was subsequently taken to Kano, that Yori, Nogaski, Wawa, and Kaima before passing into Yoruba country, reaching the coast at Lagos. And this is quite pathetic. And there were also three others who had their stories recorded through having the good fortune of being embarked in slave ships, which were intercepted by the British Navy's anti-slavery squadron, and in consequence, they were liberated. Some of them, of course, the story of Ajayi Crowther, falls within this category of people who were lucky in the process, right, to be returned by the British, all right, who intercepted the ships or the merchants and prevented them from being carried away. This is quite very, very fascinating. There is even a more important account by a gentleman named Muhammad Gado Bukwa from Bogu area, who was captured and sold on his way from an evening hangout with his friends. All right, just so when you see Yahoo boy, taking a girl out, right, on a dinner or something hangout and using them, for those who follow Yahoo boys, so it's not a new phenomenon. These were some of the stuff that crept into African consciousness, with the transatlantic slave trade. This Mohammed Gado account was quite fascinating. Between the 16th and 17th century, there were many slave trade markets established by people, all right, of African and European, by African and European merchants, particularly in some areas. People, young ordinary people, had affiliation, had connection with prominent African merchants, with even European merchants, all right, to betray their brethren. When I was talking about betrayal earlier, you could see, so someone would just go on an outing, for instance, during the period with a friend without knowing that the friend had a negotiation. He had negotiations or agreement with some slave merchants who just made. So if you watch Mandinka, the rules, you see that a particular scenario like that. All right, in the movie, I think in the part one. So some of this, development was quite rampant between the 18th and the 19th century. So importantly, there were quite a number of slave markets, all right, operated by Europeans and African merchants. All right, in the present day Nigeria, one of such ports was Vlekete, all right, which is in modern day Badagry. So Vlekete is a major port in Nigeria, which is located in. It was established in 1802. That is to show you how long the slave trade had been in existence. So Vlekete was also called a point of no return. It was the final departure point of the African side, of the terrible transatlantic slave route between the 16th and the 19th century. So one of the European explorer Clapperton accounts, he wrote extensively about, the travel, about this kind of slave channel, and he revealed that while many African rulers aided the Atlantic slave trade, few members of the indigenous elite also reacted against it, and we're going to be looking at that basically in our next class. The next topic we'll be looking at is the protesters of Africa, of the transatlantic slave trade. Who were those people who condemned, who fought against the transatlantic slave trade? We are going to look at much of all of these basically. So, but the point I'm trying to make is that each district village head had its own cells. The slave trade was an organized, criminal activity. Criminal, yeah, that's the word to use. So it was well supported by various indigenous chiefs, all right, who collaborated with Europeans and different warriors and different rulers of other states, all right, to commit murder, all right, to commit this human degradation, all right. Each of the district heads and village heads by the 19th century had their own cell from which prisoners were taken, to the slave market. People, not prisoner, of course, in some cases, people were penalized, all right. Who were penalized in a particular community were kept in, cells, in prison cells, and were sold without trial. So this will tell you how, complex and how intricate this obnoxious enterprise was conducted. So it was a period of rape, it was a period of loot, it was a period of destruction, perversion, all right, and destruction of African, social and the indigenous system. You could see from the slide, this is, a particular slave cell in Badagry, for instance. This is called the Barakon, all right, where 40 people are kept in a particular cell. Imagine that your small room in the hostel, that the cell is not more bigger than that. 40 able-bodied men and women will be kept per cell, all right, waiting for the buyers to come and buy, all right. And each time, like I said, each time I go to the archives, all right, today I decided not to go. On Friday, so when I left the archives in Oxford here, I was depressed. Over the weekend, I was in Kew Gardens. I went to London. I went to the Kew Gardens, the British Archives in London, and I was depressed. I almost had no mental health issue as a result of stuff I was reading about the effect of the transatlantic slave trade, how people were treated, or how humans were degraded and abused and molested and tortured, dehumanized by fellow humans. Well, from our next class, we would discuss basically the responses of some Africans to the slave trade before we now look at the impact. So the impact will be the last one I will teach. Then we'll now go to our group presentation. Right. If you have any question at this juncture, I think it would be appropriate to any question, please. Do we have questions?
No, sir.
Okay. So I believe you guys are taking notes. Like as I said last week, I believe you guys are forming your notes from the teaching, whether as I'm teaching or through engaging with the recordings which I put on the YouTube channel. All right. So you have to demonstrate a proper understanding and context in which this course is situated. So if you go and start using AI to reproduce what is non-existent, what is not all right documented and properly analyzed, well, I don't know how that might be, but I would say that